So hello. Hi, I'm Annalyn Schooley. I'm part of the Florida Interest Network, and we are here for part 2 of Irma Barron's discussion of Bowen theory. I'm going to share my screen so that we can look at the PowerPoint, and there it is. And those of you who have not looked at part 1, it is available on YouTube, and just look for Bowen for Beginners, and you will find it. So it is with great pleasure I again introduce Dr. Irma Barron, my fellow NOVA graduate, who is now at Alviso University and our resident Bowen specialist.
Thank you, Annalyn. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is part 2, Bowen for Beginners, part 2. And so I just wanted to just give an overview in the next slide of the Bowen theory. Is a family systems theory, and it's a theory of human behavior that views the family as an emotional unit and uses systems thinking to describe the complex interactions within that unit. Next slide. And then I have a photo of Dr. Murray Bowen here again, for those of you that did not have an opportunity to see part 1. He was a psychiatrist, and he originated the theory and the 8 interlocking concepts that we had talked about in part 1, using systems thinking to both integrate knowledge of the human species as a product of evolution and the knowledge from the Family Research Center as well, and the research that he had done. Next slide. So we left off on differentiation. And so now the part 2, we're going to spend some time talking about marital levels of differentiation and their offspring. So when we're looking at that, we have a saying that waters seek their levels. So when people get together, whether they marry or they're in a committed relationship, they will have more or less the same level of differentiation as this person that they're attracted to, as a future partner, as a future mate. So this is, again, based on an internal level. It's called the basic level of differentiation. It's the genuine, it's the core self of the differentiation of the person. And then whatever external events that are going on, because it's constantly going on in the environment, that will disturb the family system and the balance, the homeostasis of the family balance. So we're looking at that over the course of time, down the generational tree, that then we can come up with a degree of what is called chronic anxiety, a degree of chronic anxiety throughout the years that one inherits. So things are not good or bad in Bowen natural systems theory. Things just are. It's just a product of evolution, of depending on what family tribe you came from, what is that level of anxiety that was passed down to you. And really what we're looking at it too is on an evolutionary scale of how do we survive? You know, how has our ancestors adapted and assimilated a very changing, hostile environment. And really, we're all a product of survival. You know, our parents did good because we're here. So that's what we want to look at in terms of the evolutionary scale. So in the next slide, I tried to also add some photos on here too, so that everybody can get an idea of families in the 21st century. So there's 3 patterns of emotional functioning that we would assess. We would assess first conflict between the mates, conflict between the partners. A second way of assessing would be a disproportionate adaptation by one partner in order to preserve harmony, in order to maintain equilibrium. And the third one would be the focus of parental anxiety onto a child. And so of these 3, the one that we would favor is we would favor conflict between partners, because we would want to make sure that the parental anxiety doesn't get transmitted down into the offspring. And so we can work with two adults in the system that can make decisions in the system. And that's really what we're looking at. Next slide, please. So again, we're looking at a family and her offspring here, and we're looking at how she is going to create the differentiation sufficient for her children. Next slide. So when we're looking at the parental differentiation, parents have the task of functioning in ways that will permit their offspring to individuate. I mean, that's really the role of a parent is, you know, what can I do? What are the skills that I can give my offspring so that he or she can survive life without me? That's really what it means to be a good parent. To be a good parent doesn't mean to cuddle a child and have them there at the house until they're 35 years of age, but rather, how can I push this child out and launch this child into the world to do life on her own? So parents will function in ways that will result in their children achieving either the same degree of emotional separation from them that they achieved from their parents. Next slide. So when we're looking at the development of differentiation, children will grow up to have more differentiation than their parents. There are some children that are much more differentiated than their parents. Some will grow up to have less differentiation, and others will grow to have about the same. And again, and I'll go further into the webinar to discuss the differences there. In the next slide. So when we're looking at all children do not separate the same emotionally from their parents. So let's talk about maybe a child that is born with a medical condition, a child that in a sense that needs medical care. That child is going to probably have a harder time separating emotionally from whoever the primary caregivers are. So I also hear Bowen always talked about the parents, but again, because we're in the 21st century, I want to be very clear, whoever are the primary caregivers. And when we're talking about marital status, whoever's in a committed relationship as well. So we really want to bring Bowen into the 21st century in that sense of contemporary relationships and families. So usually then the other children in the family life cycle, they're free to individuate. They're free to go off and launch into the world because the parental anxiety is being projected onto this one child that has a medical condition, so requires a lot more care. So a lot of the other children can pretty less are free. They don't need that much parental attention. So I wanted to just clarify that. And again, things are not good or bad. They just are in that sense. Sometimes the youngest in the family system is fine. There's no medical condition, but because it's the baby, maybe the primary caregivers will hold on to that last child because they don't want to launch that child and then have an empty nest. So it depends. The firstborn usually is the recipient of the major anxiety because it's based on a fantasy system of what the parents wanted. They were fantasizing whether they were going to have a boy or a girl, what name they were going to give their child, what their child was going to look like, how their child was going to grow up. So again, it might be very hard for the firstborn, number one, not to come down with symptoms. It might be hard for that firstborn to pull apart, emotionally separate, and launch into the world. So it really depends on the degree of anxiety. Now, if there's a second child that is born, then depending on the gender, if that is the gender that, let's say, the parents wanted, then that anxiety may lift from the firstborn and may go on to the second one. Or let's say the first one doesn't want to fulfill the responsibilities of being the firstborn eldest. Let's say they don't want it. And so now that anxiety will go on to the second one. So the sibling position, it doesn't really necessarily determine birth order, even though the birth order is important, especially with firstborn children. but it really determines the position that each child agreed to accept. What are the terms? So sometimes you may have the youngest sibling turn out to be the responsible eldest. Again, if there's 5 or 6 years of separation, then in that family life cycle, that child becomes a firstborn all over again. And of course, if we have that significant generational gaps, 10 years, blended families are coming into the play. We could have maybe 2 separate firstborns in the family life cycle as well, when they all come together. So I just wanted everybody to really see how that sibling position comes into play. Now, when children do launch, when they do leave home, they're going to replicate the same version of the family relationship patterns with others. If the child achieved a small degree of emotional separation from his or her family, that same degree of emotional separation is going to be played out in other important, significant relationships in his or her life, whether they're professional relationships, and the more intense ones, of course, are going to be the personal, intimate relationships that come into play. Next slide. So we have the differentiation, and then in the differentiation, we have 2 levels. As I said earlier, we have the basic differentiation, which is the core genuine self. That's determined by the degree of emotional separation an individual achieved from his or her family of origin. So the higher that level is, the more consistently high is the functioning level. Now, functioning level is the pseudo self. So the functioning level of differentiation are a chain of events, geographical moves, career moves, marital status, births, deaths, people entering and exiting the system of that sort. So those are the functional levels. So someone's functioning can increase by someone entering a system or exiting a system, but that doesn't change the basic differentiation. That doesn't change the core. Those are functional levels. People may get better when they pull apart and they move to the other part of the United States. That's a functional change. But that basic self is still going to replicate the same version of what they had when they left home. So the less the discrepancy that you have in functional levels of the people that are closest with one another. I'm receiving something in the chat. We'll get to that later. And the next slide, please. So individuals that have a high basic level can adapt to changes such as births and deaths without much alteration in functional level, and with much less symptoms as well, what we call critical moments in a family, in contrast to poorly differentiated people who can experience a permanent drop in functioning after such events. We've had cases of maybe a woman giving birth, and then all of a sudden she becomes a non-functioning mother, or we have now, or she becomes depressed after the birth of a child, so her functioning really drastically plummets. Or we'll have then fathers too that maybe start drinking a little bit too much after the birth of a child, because they're trying to come to terms with feeling neglected and abandoned because the mother now is providing so much attention to the offspring. So we have those scenarios as well. The next slide. So the functional level can either be enhanced by relationships such as drugs, belief systems, cultural values, religiosity, and even superstitions, magical thinking, so they can, again, that can be enhanced, the functional levels. And so functional levels may be higher at work, okay, in the professional arena than it is at home. There's been a lot of high functioning high functioning individuals that are CEOs, and they are presidents of countries, etc., that you would think they're very, very powerful. But then when they walk through the threshold of the domicile, their functioning level is not the same in intimate relationships. So a parent's functional level may either increase or decrease after the birth of a child. So again, that also depends on were they ready to have a child? I know that we very careful when we do our assessments. We ask very matter-of-fact questions that we want to remain as neutral as possible. We really want to tone down any type of emotionality when we are making an assessment. And we're asking questions. Was this a planned pregnancy? You know, was this something that you had planned? Was this something that your partner had agreed to? And so we can then open up space for a conversation in the therapy room. Next slide. So the treatment plan basically is what we're looking at is the Bowenian treatment plan, a family systemic treatment plan, is how do we work with clients in achieving a higher level of core, of the differentiation of self, the genuine self, which means how can we teach them, how can we coach them to increase their capacity for emotional detachment or neutrality. Now, let's be careful with the word emotional detachment, because that doesn't mean that a person emotionally insulates themselves and withdraws from society. That's not what we're talking about. How can you stay in emotional contact with people that you really care about, that can push your buttons, that you can be easily triggered with? How can you create that degree of separation, of that detachment, where you're not reactive, but that you remain cognitive? How can you stay neutral? How can you predict that this person in the family, that her actions or his actions are predictable based on previous functioning? So you're not surprised. You're not caught by surprise if you're able to predict this. So really what we like to do is how can we get our families, our couples, our clients to engage more thinking than more feeling. And I had said in the part 1 webinar, most psychotherapies, what is it, 97% more or less, are feeling based. Beginning with the clinician asking, and how do you feel today? And so the person is drowning in feelings and emotions. And so the therapist is taking them over, like very Shakespearean, to the deep lake. And okay, let me drown you more in feelings by asking you how your feelings are. So we don't want to do that. We really want to engage them on what are your thoughts? What are you thinking about this? To get them out of the feeling-based system. So changes are reflected in the ability to be in emotional contact with a difficult, emotionally charged problem, and not feel compelled to preach about what others should do, not rush in to fix the problem, and not pretend to be detached by emotionally insulating oneself. And so really, you know, I love the saying of fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And so really, you know, the shoulds, that you have to fix someone, you have to fix your mate, you have to, you know, fix your mother-in-law, fix your own parents. And really, how do you drop that tension, the string, the cord of tension, and really just look at emotionally charged issues? And like Bowen would say, don't do anything, stand still. And that's a Bowen quote. Don't do anything, just stand still. Allow the anxiety to whirl around you. Allow it. Don't bite the bait. And so that's how we would teach the clients. So again, Dr. Bowen never called himself a therapist. He never called himself, he called himself a coach. He said he was a family coach. And he said that what we were doing was we were coaching families. We were coaching couples. And we want to work with the adults in the system. We want to work with the people that can make the decisions. And we know that children cannot be differentiated because they are emotionally attached to their primary caregivers and also financially as well. So we want to be very careful when we're working with clients and they want to get better. We have to really make a thorough assessment. Is number one, can they afford to differentiate? Can they afford it financially? Can they afford it emotionally? And those are two very important questions, because they may just come for what we call symptom relief, but they may not be able to be invested for long change because they are financially dependent on their partner, or the children are financially dependent on their primary caregivers. So that's one of the reasons why Bowen was very clear about working with people that can actually have the capacity for change. And to go back to what Annalyn had said earlier, and the MRI question that's famous is, and ask clients, what have you tried that has worked in the past? And why do you think, and that hasn't worked, and why do you think it's going to work today? What is different? And maybe the client will turn around and say, well, in the past, I was under my thumbnail of my father, and now my father is now dead, and now I can live my life. Okay, so that's information. That's information in the sense of that's very, very telling. What's interesting, though, is that that's a functional change, because the client wasn't able to differentiate when his father was alive. So we want to, and again, things are not good or bad, they just are. So we want to be very aware that any functional changes, whatever happens in his life later on, may be contingent on whoever are the key persons in his life, that he may not be able to be a person that he wants to be, but that he's really the chameleon adapting to whoever is in that family system that he's emotionally attached to. Next slide. So again, achieving a higher, thank you. So systems principles allows us, the clinicians, to be in contact with the problem, but not be a part of it. So the ability to be in contact with a problem, but not part of it, relates to the emotional neutrality and detachment. Now, the emotional neutrality, it's infinite. The capacity to continue to practice it is with whatever challenges you're faced in your lifespan. Like right now, I think all of us are faced with, what we're all dealing with since March of 2020. And so really to just be very self-reflective to see, were there times that I was practicing emotional neutrality, or were there times that I was feeling emotionally triggered or charged by what was going on with local and world events since we're still in the pandemic, obviously. So the neutrality can continue as much as one's capacity to continue to be challenged by whatever is coming through, whatever life forces are going on in the environment. Next slide. And so again, neutrality is reflected in the ability to be calm about what goes on between others, to be aware of all of the emotionally determined sides of an issue, to be aware of the influence of subjectivity on one's notions about what should be. So I'll share a story with you. Again, one has to talk about one's family of origin. And so when my father died, it was a tremendous little event for my mother because they were literally both joined at the hip. And my mother had a really difficult time. And so she thought that I was going to step in, and I was going to sort of like be my father and be back and forth and everything, and so everything for her was an emergency. And so every time that she would call me, she expected me to drop everything and go run and do this and do that. And I remember one time I went to her and I said, listen, mother, I can't go today to the pharmacy and then tomorrow because she remembered something. I need you to give me a list of everything that you need. And we're going to run an errand. We're going to do all these errands on one day. So she was very upset with me and she said, don't be so efficient. So, but we accomplished efficiency of giving me one list and we were going to do it one day only because I could not do it every single day. And then everything was an emergency and everything was a crisis and everything was a 911. So finally, it's never too late for a person to change. Remember that. So the Bowen family system works very well with the elderly population, with the geriatric population. I got to the point where I had my mother, where she would call on the phone and she would say, this is your mother, like I can't recognize her voice. But this is not an emergency, darling. This is not an emergency, but call your mother when you can. So that was a huge accomplishment, huge, rather than everything was a 911. So it worked, it was very successful, but it had to be consistent. And there's a behavioral component as well, but you had to be, again, the consistency, but it worked. And so I share this story with all of you because we're never too old and we're never too young to really learn to do something differently with change. It's never late. It's never too late. Next slide, please. And the next slide. So, symptom development. So, if your basic differentiation is poor, is low, the lower the level of the differentiation, the higher will be the chronic anxiety. The higher the chronic anxiety, the more receptive you are to developing symptoms. If you raise the basic level of differentiation, individuals will become asymptomatic. The symptoms will submerge again. And so that's really, how do you again stay with an emotionally charged problem, but practice that emotional detachment, and that neutrality will help. In some families, we have certain family members that are more sensitive to the anxiety that's going on. They become the symptom bearer. They become what we would call the identified patient. In some families, depending on how severe and high is the chronic anxiety, you may have 2 or 3 family members that are considered the identified patient as well. In families where everybody is appearing to function relatively, quote unquote, normal, everything is fine except for one identified patient. Usually those families are harder to treat because they have organized their equilibrium around this one symptom bearer. And so if you work with this one identified patient, then the other family members, the anxiety is going to have to go somewhere. So the system may develop another identified patient in that sense, or there may be pressure from the client to continue to consent to being, quote unquote, the sacrificial lamb for the sake of maintaining homeostasis. So that's why in part of family systems, sometimes we don't necessarily want to work with the identified patient, which is something very different. We want to work with all the family members that are in the family system that are successful in triggering this person to become symptomatic. And so that's why working with children without working with the primary caregivers or whoever are the legal guardians usually proves to be unsuccessful. And the only thing we do is reinforce the family projection process by just treating children and not treating the entire family system. So again, family systems theory links all clinical symptoms to the emotional system, and a disturbance in the balance, both within an individual and within his or her relationship, can trigger the development of symptoms. Symptoms can be generated by an anxiety-driven togetherness process that's characterized by members pressuring one another on how to think, how to feel, how to act in specific ways, even what to eat, what not to eat. So when we're looking at that pressure of that togetherness, folks can become symptomatic. Now, on the other hand, folks that also push away can also become symptomatic as well. So sometimes breaking free of that togetherness process, one can alleviate their symptoms. In other cases, breaking away, one can become symptomatic. Next slide. So symptoms can also be generated by a disruption of togetherness that has sustained someone's functioning. So the more members of a relationship system function in reaction to one another, the more likely someone in the system, usually the most poorly differentiated or the least undifferentiated, will become symptomatic. Next slide. In contrast to the members of a family that are able to be in contact with one another, however, the ability to remain emotionally autonomous, to have what we call personal agency, the less likely someone will become symptomatic. Next slide. So, symptom relief. Symptoms can also be relieved by coming together or pulling apart. Again, things are not good or bad. It's just, what is it that each individual needs to alleviate, to feel symptom relief? Is it coming closer to my family tribe? Or do I need to get some air? Do I need to get some separation? And then I can feel better. Yes, I'll be happy to talk about that. I'll be talking about cutoff in this webinar. So in basic levels of differentiation, an increase in the basic level can reduce the symptoms. And if the member or members are closely connected to the symptomatic person, what we would call in mental health, the identified patient, the IP, that person can raise their basic level. The symptomatic will then be able to increase his or her functioning in order to decrease symptoms. So that's really how one would, that would be the course of treatment. That would be the trajectory of really what would you be doing therapeutically or clinically with an individual or with a family in this sense. Next slide. So, and again, we wanted to show contemporary families. So critical moments in a family, like I had stated earlier, these are functional levels of differentiation, describes functioning that is linked to the emotionally driven relationship process. Either overfunctioning or underfunctioning is an anxiety-driven process. Functioning that is, and the is I capitalized on purpose, is dependent on the relationship process. So functioning that is dependent on the relationship. So for example, with couples, if you have a classic overfunctioner, then usually that person is going to gravitate towards a classic underfunctioner, and then you have a complementary relationship. But if you have two partners and they're both overfunctioners, they're going to compete to see who can overfunction more. Now, get two underfunctioners together, I don't know if that will ever happen. That would be an interesting study. When two people come together that they're both underfunctioning, probably Bowen would say there will be a seesaw effect. And of the two, someone's going to have to buck up and step up to the plate and do a little bit more. So we may not be able to see it that much. So the lower the differentiation, the more acute you'll be able to see these differences. So the higher the level of differentiation, the higher functioning couples, the discrepancy may be very, very small to see. Maybe in cases of maybe nodal events in the family where maybe there's a death or a hospitalization or a loss of employment or something like that, then you might want to see someone, maybe you might want to see the overfunctioner not able to function, and then the underfunctioner steps up. So we can call that reciprocal functioning. And then as soon as the overfunctioner gets well, then the underfunctioner goes back over to how they operate. So we see that wonderful sometimes among couples that they will step in and they will take turns. Next slide. So basically, Dr. Engel, George Engel, he's a researcher in psychosomatic medicine, and he always proposes the question to his medical students. When a patient gets ill, the question is, and this is really the only why that we ever ask in family systems, because we never ask why. We always do the what, the who, what, where, and when. But in this case, we want to know why this patient has this particular illness at this point. What is going on right now in the family system that this person has become symptomatic? And that's the curiosity that we want to see. When we would talk about, we call it the precipitating event, you know, whatever occurred at this moment. Why is this a problem now? Why is there all of a sudden marital conflict at this moment? Why is Johnny acting out in school at this moment? What is going on? There's something else that's going on. But that's really the only time that we're going to be asking the why question. Next slide. So again, here's a classic example of bad medicine and bad psychotherapy. Treating a child in individual therapy, relieving the symptoms, but reinforcing the family projection process. So this would be an example of what we would call bad medicine, of really ignoring the processes that operate at multiple levels and treating a clinical dysfunction on just one level. And as a reinforcement of that process that's ignored. So if I take that child and just work on that child exclusively and not address whatever is going on in the family, whatever is going on among the primary caregivers, whoever the parents are, then I'm just basically reinforcing the projection process. And basically my actions as a clinician is telling them, you were exactly right. There was something wrong with Johnny, and that's why I'm treating Johnny. And so that's one of the things that we really don't want to do. Next slide, please. So enhancement versus inhibition. So again, in functioning, we're either enhancing the functioning of some individuals in the family system, whoever our partners are, whoever our mates are, whoever our children, and in undermining the functioning of others. So the emotional system can function to preserve the stability of the total relationship systems, either by enhancing one or two members, but undermining the functioning of others as well. So one of the things that we want to do when we are working with a client, with the families, we want to make sure that working on increasing their functioning is never at the expense of others in the family or of their mate or of their children. We want to make sure that there's always a balance in that sense, that they're not impinging themselves onto others, you know, stepping over them to function higher. Next slide. So acute to chronic, we all know that acute is something that is a rapid onset, and then usually it dissipates. In some cases, acute can turn into a chronic phase. And sometimes that has to do with the degree of differentiation that the family system may have. We've had, again, exaggerated views for illustration purposes for this webinar, but low functioning families where there is a death of a family glue, and that person has, again, exited the system and the family has plummeted to the bottom and they haven't been able to reorganize since. So usually in higher functioning families, if there's a death of a family glue, the system will reorganize. There will be a period of disorganization. Obviously, the system has to recalibrate. But of that system, a family member will step up to the plate and become the new family glue. But in poorly differentiated families, no one may be able to step up to the plate and bring that family out of that disorganization. So as members get more anxious, they learn, they lean on or they withdraw from one another more. The leaning on and the retreating from and insisting that one another change. Someone often absorbs a disproportionate share of the system's anxiety. So we talked about that, whether it's a mate, whether it's a partner that becomes a symptom bearer in the dyad in the couple's relationship, or certain family members that also absorb that anxiety in the family. Next slide. So in this process, the member becomes more vulnerable to symptoms. If family anxiety soon returns to what we call pre-event levels, the symptom will usually be short-lived. However, if the family anxiety becomes bound, remember we talked about anxiety binders in webinar part 1, then the bounds in chronic focus, then the symptomatic one, the dysfunction will become chronic. If that family system bounds that anxiety around that identified patient, so that acute phase then turns into a chronic phase. And we know that in medicine and anything in life, the worst thing that we can have if we're ever working with the medical model and medical systems is whenever they say that a patient has had a chronic problem for X amount of time. And it's sort of like everyone just sort of like puts their hands up and says, oh, it's chronic. So really the moment, the action is whenever anyone is in an acute situation of an acute nodal event or an acute critical moments in the family, to make sure that that phase doesn't shift to chronic. And again, I repeat, this is not good or bad. We do not talk about pathology, but I want to just give you different examples for illustrative purposes. And remember, you're not going to see usually high-functioning couples coming to see you. Think about it. They're going to be home making dinner and having a glass of red wine, right? They're going to be fine. You're going to work with couples that are having marital conflict or have a problem with one of their children, or one of the partners is developing symptoms or has a diagnosis of some sort, or his or her diagnosis has exacerbated since the relationship. We know cases where couples will get together and one person was in remission for whatever, nothing serious, functioning, and then all of a sudden the togetherness process has triggered symptoms in that person. So if they pull apart, if they withdraw a little bit, they're able to manage their symptoms. Look at the next slide. And the next one. So I want to talk about cutoff now and symptoms. In individuals and nuclear families who are cut off emotionally from their families of origin in degrees ranging from either minor and insignificant to major and significant cutoff. Cutoff from these families of origin to reduce the discomfort generated by being in emotional contact with them. So I want to say that cutoff is neither good or bad. In some cases, family members have had to cut off for whatever reasons. There have been horrific cases of abuse and neglect. And the person had to just, the child had to grow up and get emancipated and get out, and the cutoff was a way of saving her life, so we don't want to send that person back, obviously, to the abuser, and we've had cases too of sexual abuse, etc. So a way of repairing the cutoff would be letter writing that we talked about in part 1. The narrative therapy is important. If the abuser has died, then the letter writing could be very symbolic, and then there could be a ritual where they could bury it at the gravesite, or they could read it out loud, and then later on they could shred it. But it's something that could happen in terms of how healing can take place. But we never want to force anyone to go back home to repair a cutoff that could put them in danger, or could trigger them or exacerbate any type of trauma that they have had. So I really want to be clear about that. Next slide. So cutoff can be used to reduce anxiety as a means of survival. So again, I repeat, it's not good or bad. And while people and nuclear families can reduce anxiety by cutting off, people in nuclear families can also increase anxiety by cutting off. So you can reduce or you can increase. Now, what happens in the cutoff, and I think it's in the next slide, is if for whatever reasons the cutoff cannot be repaired, then that person is going to replicate that same version in other parts of life, whether it's professional relationships, personal intimate relationships. I talked about in webinar number 1, people that all of a sudden come together, in this fusion, this whole, well, don't be surprised that as fast as they fuse, they break away just as drastic and just as severe. So we've got this drastic fusion and then the opposite of cutoff. So we're looking at it on that polar opposite dichotomous scale. All right, so these are very, very severe cases of one extreme of fusion and the other extreme of cutoff. So most people, high functioning, moderately high functioning individuals, are not on those opposite poles. They fall somewhere in between, give or take whatever the standards of deviation are. Next slide. So the greater the undifferentiation or the fusion between the generations, the greater the likelihood that the generations will cut off from one another. So again, folks that are operating on that extreme opposites of the poles are usually undifferentiated. We're looking at not severe, but poorly undifferentiated individuals. So reducing emotional cutoff from the past is one of the most important elements of therapy whenever possible. And again, it doesn't mean to go and face the abuser, but again, how do you reduce that letter writing, maybe engaging with other family members around, and I call it spreading the anxiety with other family members, as long as your client feels safe, as long as he feels safe and he's not triggered. Next slide. So the amount of so here's the confusion sometimes that students sometimes have. The amount of physical distance that exists between people and their families of origin is not equivalent to the amount of emotional distance that exists. People can live several thousand miles away, different separate continents. They can be in better emotional contact with each other than people who live in the same town, on the same street, or in the same house as their family of origin. So geographical separation does not represent cutoff unless the geographic separation was a means of cutting off. So if you have a student that started to apply for universities on the West Coast of the United States. So we want to always be curious, was this a thoughtful process because all the good schools are over there, quote unquote, or was this a means of getting away from family of origin? So we really, and again, and this is the conversation that you would have then with your client, you know, or people that are finding a job in another continent. Was this a thoughtful process, or was this a way of getting away? And then all of a sudden, you know, the family follows you, and then you have to pick up and go somewhere else. So we want to be clear about that, you know. And sometimes because we're down here in South Florida and we're the microcosm of the world, and we're so international that sometimes the students get a little distraught because they say, oh my goodness, I'm cut off from my family. I'm on another continent, or I'm in another country, I'm in a different time zone. And we have a conversation, and I go, no, that's not what that is. So it's very different when we're dealing with folks that are here for different reasons, you know, immigration and things like that. That's not necessarily cut off, unless it is a means of cutting off. And then we've had students that have come over here and folks that have come here to the United States, and finally they say, wow, I can now be who I am. And so now we're looking at functional changes. I was not able to do all of these things. I was not able to work outside my home. I was not able to love a person that I want to love with, or do whatever I want to do at this moment because my culture, my family, in my country would not allow it, or there was too much pressure. So those are functional changes. And of course, again, things are not good or bad, because there are many cases and many systems around the world that to differentiate could cost your life. So we want to be clear about that. So, you know, if you have the Taliban and you want to differentiate as a woman, you're not going to walk down the street in Western wear. That will cost your life. So I want to be clear about sometimes folks have not had that freedom because their life is at stake to differentiate until they're able to come here to the United States. In some cases, they did have the freedom, but the family did not give them the freedom. So we're talking about functional, which is very, very different in that sense. Next slide, please. So cutoff may relieve immediate pressure and lower anxiety, but the person's basic vulnerabilities to intense relationships will remain unchanged. And the more complete the cutoff with the past, the more likely that more intense version of the past or its mirror image will be repeated in the present. And again, so we really want to look at that, especially when you're doing couples therapy, and maybe you have people that do serial dating, or they're, you know, fusion cutoff, then we want to explore a family of origin and to see, you know, how much cutoff goes on in their family tree as well. Next slide. In terms of the cutoff, if we're able to repair the cutoff, we're able to reduce the symptoms, and then we're able to teach our clients coaching how to stay in an emotionally charged situation and then practice that neutrality. And that comes with practice. And so they may have to, let's say for the beginning, maybe they're working on repairing cutoff, and it's safe for them to do it. Maybe the cutoff will only be, okay, so you're going to go visit your parents. You're only going to stay for 15 minutes. When you feel that the anxiety is increasing, you look at the time. Can you stay there for 15 minutes? We call that exposure therapy, right? Right. So that's what it is. That's all. And then see how you can extend it a little longer. And how can you extend it a little longer? And then, of course, we love the fall season. We love holidays, because this is a wonderful opportunity for clients and for ourselves to be in emotionally charged situations during holidays and the rituals and everything that it revolves around there. Same thing with funerals and births. People that are not religious, have you noticed? how all of a sudden they're calling all their family members to find out, what are we supposed to do? You know, how do we do this? You know, what's the ceremony? What are the rules? Because again, it's an anxiety-driven process. There are nodal events that are going on, and everybody's taking out to see how we're going to do this and how we're going to do this the right way. So, and those are the critical moments in a family. But those are opportunities for your clients and for yourself to go back and work on that and ask yourself, you know, when was the last time that you experienced a critical moment in your family? And maybe some of us have, because of the pandemic that we're in. Maybe we've had family members that have been hospitalized. Maybe we have family members that have died. You know, how have we handled that? You know, how are we working on that right now? You know, these are very trying times. I think more than ever, besides, I think 9/11, I shared that in part 1. 9/11 was a very trying time here nationally and around the world. For me, from my experience, I think that now COVID has been sort of like the equivalent of how I felt for 9/11, but for me personally, and it still continues. So, and how do we handle it? You know, what is it that we do? I know what I have done. I have turned off my television since March of 2020. And guess what I did 2 weeks ago? I gave it away. I gave it away. There. I don't need to watch any breaking news, because the breaking news is going to come into my telephone anyway. And I can't give my phone away, although I've thought about it. But again, you know, what is it? What is it that we do? You know, what is it that we do? How do we manage our anxiety? That's all it is. And we can't judge. So growing away from one's family depends on gaining more emotionally objectivity. Notice how it's written, growing away, individuating, leaving home, staying emotionally connected, but having that emotional objectivity. So more objectivity means one is better able to see the ways in which he or she is part of the system, the ways in which he or she affects the emotional functioning of others, and the way others affect his or her emotional functioning. That's really what it means to have that emotional objectivity and growing away. Next slide. So if one sees himself, herself as part of the system, then she or he has a new option: to stay in contact with others and change self. This does not mean changing self under pressure from the togetherness process, because that will happen in therapy. Some clients will have to leave, they will check out, they will terminate prematurely because there's been too much family pressure. Oh, don't listen to that woman, she's putting crazy thoughts in your head. Oh no, what happened to that nice person that I married? What happened to that nice son that I would need? No. And so there's that, again, in order to change, it's challenging the system, and you're upsetting that homeostasis until a new one can be created. So it means changing self based on a process that comes from within the person. How do I exercise my personal agency? How do I not become the sacrificial lamb? And how do I do it thoughtfully without cutting off? It's a tall order. It's not easy, you know. And can I stand that pressure? And can I be there in that heat of emotionally driven family members or people that I'm intimately involved with, asking me, don't do that, don't change, or I'll leave you, you know, because there's also different threats. Parents love to disinherit their children, right? That's a wonderful threat. Oh, I'm going to stop paying for your college tuition, or you're going to have to buy your own car. So, you know, how can you work with clients, and how can they afford to differentiate? Next slide, please. So recognition of the degree of emotional cutoff from each partner, spouse, from her or his family of origin is very important in the family therapy. And so again, if you're doing couples therapy, it'd be really good to do a genogram on partner A and a genogram on partner B to see the degree of cutoff, to see how did they leave home? How did they grow up? How were they launched? You know, was it a thoughtful process? Or were they two refugees from the family and they met on a Friday night and they thought, gee, let's get together, you know, and let's run away from home together, you know, sort of like, let's elope, you know. Which is another thing too, which is very interesting. That's another debate. That's not a debate, but that's another topic in terms of weddings. You know, did you invite everybody present? Because that's really what a ceremony is. You know, you want everybody here to witness. Or did you just run off to Las Vegas and did a real quick elopement and didn't tell anybody? You know, so again, that's because you were afraid that your family wasn't going to accept you or accept your mate or recognize or validate it. So again, those are questions too. How did the two of you meet? You know, how long was courtship? That's important to ask. You know, how long did you date one another? Because you're not only dating one another, but you're dating each other's families. And so maybe the date could go on for maybe a year and a half, because, you know, someone can put up an act for so long, but it's great to have holidays and notable events during that courtship period so you can see how your partner, your future mate, how the family responds, how your mate responds, you know, what am I getting into? You know, this is a package deal that I'm going to be getting into. So it's, does seeking, needing, well, we'll get to those questions later. I'll answer them. So again, the courtship is very important. Next slide. So reestablishing cutoff, I know that this is sort of like more of what I had said. People who are significantly cut off and who develop serious symptoms may get complete or at least partial remission of those symptoms based on reestablishing contact with the family. So whenever possible, we would want to get the couples to go back to their family of origins and see how they can repair that cutoff, because one of the things that you want to do is there's too much anxiety in the dyad. So when we have two people that are refugees from their family of origin, it's too much pressure for the dyad. It's too much. They need to have contact with other significant family members in their life as well. Your partner cannot be your mother, your brother, your father, your sister, your best friend, you know, those beautiful romantic love songs that, you know, they don't work. It's not practical. They're beautiful and they're romantic, but you cannot be my everything. It's impossible. And so that's one of the things that you really want to educate. Remember, Dr. Bowen, we're educators, we're coachers, you know, we coach. We give couples the freedom that they don't have to do their life the way that their parents did their life or their grandparents, that they can come together and make decisions of what works for them, for their life now in 2022. Next slide.
Come on.
So the goal is not to get the family to accept you, to love you. The goal is to be more of a self, which is not contingent on acceptance. And then I think I have I think there's one or two more slides, I think. The next one. So if people are still vulnerable to getting into positions with their parents and other members of their family of origin, then they are vulnerable to doing a version of the same thing in current relationships. If people are using emotional cutoff to deal with the past, then they are using emotional distance to deal with the present. Next slide. And a person's relationships with parents, with siblings and other relatives during childhood and adolescence are the primary influences on the way that he or she will manage herself or himself in marriage, with children, and with other important people in life. and changing oneself while in relationship to the past, while in relationship to the people that are emotionally charging you, is the high road to increasing the basic level of differentiation. If you can change, if you can increase your basic core self while in relationship to the people that are pushing your buttons, then that's not a functional change. That's a true change. And you can then raise the level of differentiation of whoever is in your current circle of your intimate relationship as well. That's the high road. That's the hallmark of therapy right there for Bowen. So to increase one's ability to distinguish between thinking and feeling within self and others, and learning to use that ability to direct one's life and solve problems is the central guiding principle of family psychotherapy. Separate thinking and feeling.
All right. All right. So let's take a look a little bit at some of the questions we have here. I think you did talk about the healthy cutoff and the unhealthy cutoff. So we have a question: explain the difference between too much together and codependency.
Okay, so the togetherness process, because it's an anxiety-driven process coming together. It's us against the world. The world is out there, it's cruel, so we have to stick together. It taxes too much the dyad, the couple, or the family members, the family members that are there. So there is a degree that pressureness, that togetherness is codependency. We don't call it that, because we want to stay away from sort of those labels, but we're looking at each other impinging upon the other at that moment. Now, the togetherness process, when we're looking at enhancement and inhibition, is if my functioning increases at your expense, and I know that you have a drinking problem, but I'm an overfunctioner and I know what's best for you, and so I maintain that relationship, because I feel good taking care of you. So that's why sometimes when people sober up, relationships dissolve, because it changes the system. So how could we, and this is difficult to do, how could we treat couples where one has a drinking problem? How could we work with them to have a relationship with the alcohol? It's difficult. It's very, very difficult. But if you really look at the numbers, the relationships do not remain intact. They don't. Everything was fine as long as my partner was drinking and I was the enabler, and I did a really good job of calling in sick for my partner. And, so how do we handle that? But that's part of that togetherness process. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, you did.
Great.
And again, there's no good or bad here. I want to be very careful. I don't want to pathologize anything.
We have a question of, so if a cutoff is repaired, does this lessen the likelihood of a repeated cutoff?
Yes and no, it depends. It depends on the thoughtful process of repairing the cutoff. So the cutoff, okay, so here's the thing about the cutoff. The cutoff depends on how significant was the cutoff. Was it an acute cutoff, or is this cutoff chronic, meaning time span, years? So the longer the cutoff, it's not going to repair overnight. You're not going to send an email and all of a sudden everybody's going to be lovey-dovey again. That's not going to happen that way. There has to be a series of visits, a series of letter writings. I talked about that in the webinar number 1, where you would then write a letter once a year and basically use the I position, never use the word you, and just basically tell this person that you're cut off from what you did in the course of the year. and don't expect a response, but you have to be consistent. And then maybe one day, depending on how chronic is the cutoff, then one day you may get a response. So it's something that will take time. We're talking about severe cutoff. Now, there's cases where the cutoff was only for 3 or 4 months because the parents did not approve of a marriage or a union, but the couple went ahead and they proceeded anyway. And they continued to write letters and send photographs of, I think it was, that was another case with the birth of the baby, was what then brought the parents together because they saw, oh, look what I'm going to be missing out on. But the couples continued with the wedding. Now, here's another thing too. Are you marrying this person? Are you getting together with this person because you want to get back at your parents? Remember, we're always very curious, not the end. We're curious about the process. Was this thoughtful? Or did you deliberately find someone that you know your parents would not accept because you want to get back at them? So that's something that the client has to be honest about. And so now, why are you surprised about this cutoff? This was your way of running away from the family.
So it's interesting. I was just thinking as you were describing this, that sometimes there could be clients that you see that they haven't done the cutoff. Someone has cut off from them. And so like the child that's disappeared and the parents are like, what can we do to reconnect with our child, right? So as you said, that consistency, that contact, but no expectation, right? No
Correct.
investment
Correct.
is right. So it's not
Correct.
only
And
that one has cut off and wants to reconnect to the person they cut off from, but the person from whom someone has left and they're trying to reconnect.
right.
Okay.
And again, no judgment, but it would be wonderful material to work with the parents and to get them engaged in thinking of what reasons do you think Johnny left? And maybe do a timeline of when was there a breakdown in communication. I love the timeline. I love to do a timeline because, Johnny isn't 17 years old and all of a sudden he's aggressive and he punched the wall. No. If we do a timeline, we can find out that Johnny was aggressive when he was 7 years old and he threw a temper tantrum at one of the grocery stores. And you gave your power away. So, or Johnny was trying to individuate and you kept saying no and no and no. And so now Johnny is an adult, totally emancipated. And why would Johnny want to go back? And of course, we're not going to say it like that. I mean, I'm saying it fast now for the sake of time, but, we would have to, and it's not blaming the parents, it's for the parents to see examples of how Johnny tried to individuate, because that's healthy for children to do. It's normal for kids to want to listen to music that their parents don't like and dress like their parents don't dress. We want that. We want to see differences in generations. We want to see how children are attempting to individuate safely. And we want to see how parents can adjust to that individuation. How can they adjust to those changes of seeing their little Johnny 7, who's now 14 years old, and he wants to date someone? And, so how are they ready for that?
So I can see how it could be very tempting to think of Bowen therapy as individual therapy to work with and I believe that Bowen preferred to work with the most differentiated member of the family individually. But I could see how bringing a whole family together, that one could be working on differentiation for each of them. So it's not like the family is now going to work on Johnny's differentiation. It's that in reconnecting to Johnny or figuring out what's going on for Johnny, we're also going to have to work on the parents' issues of letting Johnny go or whatever, which is probably going to echo back to their family of origin and how they learned. So it could look like that we're doing individual therapy with each member of the family, but after a while, it's all about the relationship. So it
It's
all
all about the
starts to
relationship.
merge together. I
And
have
you
one more
triggered
question.
sure,
I have
and
one
my-
more question. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
And you triggered my memory on something. Usually when there is an issue with the parents and the child at a particular developmental stage, then one of the things that we can ask the mother or the father was, so what was going on in your life at that age? And usually we can see at that moment that that was the arrest at that time. So I wanted to just share that with everyone.
Right. Again, that timeline business is so
Mhm.
useful. This last question was, and I'm going to rephrase it. What is the relationship between someone needing validation and differentiation?
Well, a person that seeks validation is poorly differentiated in the sense that their core functioning is contingent upon whether you accept me or not. Do you think that I'm competent? Do you think I did good? So it's really a person that could be a bit of a chameleon, because that means that I'm constantly trying to get feedback from someone. I'm constantly seeking someone's approval. And then based on whatever that feedback that I receive, then I will adjust my behavior accordingly.
Mhm.
That's a chameleon.
But that's different from someone wanting to be in a relationship where they get validated not in a seeking approval kind of way, but not tolerating a negative relationship.
Oh, of course.
So it's a matter of degree. It's perfectly appropriate to expect that you're going to be in relationships that are validating.
Of course.
But if it's seeking beyond, if it's now I'm going to use boundaries because that's not the right term for this model, but the idea of staying engaged, right? Staying engaged emotionally, but not getting emotionally invested or out of control, right? Not having one's anxiety go up. And if I'm in a relationship where I'm not being validated, then probably I need to seek another relationship.
Yeah,
rather than pursuing that relationship and chameleoning myself in order to get it.
Correct. Yeah, so that person is really undermining your functioning, undermining your self-confidence, your self-esteem. Mm-hmm. Remember, Dr. Michael Kerr said, you cannot have two highly differentiated people living parallel lives. They have to come together every once in a while for intimacy. If not, why are you together in a relationship? So, I mean, a lot of people think that Bowenians are all, no, I mean, you're together, there's an emotional component, there's intimacy there that's involved, of course, yeah. So it's just making sure that your functioning isn't undermined, or that you're not walking on eggshells and now all of a sudden you don't know what to do based on,
or that you're not undermining the other's function,
or that you're not undermining the other person too. So one of the homework assignments that you can always give a client that overfunctions is, so don't be so perfect. So don't work so hard. Can you reduce your functioning by 33%, And then they look at you. Yeah, 33%. Go figure it out. You can. You're smart enough, So, and how can we get somebody to maybe raise their underfunctioning a little bit? Because remember, it's reciprocal. If we can get the overfunctioner to come down a little bit, then the underfunctioner will come up. That's all it is. It's a seesaw. It's reciprocal.
Yeah.
And it's amazing when, there's an old saying, the cemetery is buried with indispensable people. And it's always good to tell that to the overfunctioners. And by the way, we're probably all overfunctioners because we're all clinicians here.
Yeah, that we have a tendency to that. Yes.
We have a tendency to that, yes, right.
Yes.
May I add to that question?
Yes, Vanessa, please do.
So I'm picturing this, and it makes a whole lot of sense for me in terms of relationships, whether that be, and more so, I guess, romantic relationships, meaning husband and wife, husband and husband, whatever, child and parent, like family relationships. And I've seen this shift in the corporate world where it's all about get feedback and hear what they have to say and apply and do this. And it sounds to me, I'm like, okay, so, it's like the corporate world is really pushing people to be chameleons within the workplace. So does this particular topic that we just discussed, is this more so applicable to those family relationships? Does it also apply to professional relationships? And how can you be one? I mean, you already kind of mentioned you can be one way at home and then be very different at work in terms of your levels of differentiation. So there's a question in there somewhere. I hope you're reading my mind and getting it. I'm not verbalizing it.
Well, first of all, the Bowen theory is applied to corporate. So you can apply it in the therapy room, but you can also be a Bowenian business consultant. One of our professors at Nova, that's what he does. And some of my colleagues that are part of the Bowen South Florida Consortium, that's what they do. They work with businesses and they do the consulting in the businesses. So yes.
So I have a very interesting question about multiculturalism and cultural humility, ethnicity humility. How does the Bowen model take into account, given that Murray was an old white guy, let's face it, a Midwestern old white guy, so probably Christian to boot. So how does the Bowen model in the modern day take into account adapting to multiculturalism?
Well, here in South Florida, it's sort of like a matter of fact, right? Like the air that we breathe, because we're so international here in this part of Florida. It's taking into account whatever is the culture of the family. So here's a couple of things. You have the culture, but then you have the family culture. So, and they're both anxiety binders. So we would work with the client in terms of his or her culture, but then what is the actual family culture? What are the rules? Because some people can come from a particular culture, some families, but they're not really representative of that culture, and they pick and choose part of that. So we really want to hone in on that. Now, it's sort of like religion, I always, how, I don't know, how religious are you in this faith, when you pick and choose at that moment. So that's how we would go about it. We're more interested in how does the family relate to one another? What are the rules? What are the unspoken rules? And what does the family culture say about how family members should conduct themselves? Careers, should they marry outside of their culture, outside of their race, outside of their nationality? What are their views on children? How many? So that's what we really want to know. And every family varies within that larger culture. Every family varies. I hope I answered your question, Michelle.
Michelle, is there any additional question you have about that you'd like to ask? Maybe not. Yep.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for answering the question.
Okay. I think that there are some of us, sometimes the way Bowen is taught is that it seems like it's very much imposed on the family. You shall be differentiated, you shall be. And of course, imposing is antithetical to the very concepts of Bowen. And so to go in and say your family must look like this in order to be healthy. Well, first of all, Bowen doesn't even accept the idea of healthy and unhealthy, right? It's just this is how you all function, and this is how you then we're watching how the dance of the family goes, and then what do you want to do about that? Is that okay with you? If it's okay with you, we got nothing to, that's fine. If it's not okay with you, then that's something you want to work on.
Right.
Then we'll work on it.
So if someone comes for coaching, for Bowenian therapy, we're going to ask again, what would you like to work on? And as they're describing whatever is going on, one of the things that we say, instead of saying you should, remember, we don't tell people what to do, how to fix things or not fix this. The only thing that we'll ask is, and how is that working for you? And how is that working for you? And what changes would you like to make? So really, it's all about change. And really, psychotherapy should be all about change, right? So people are going to come because they want to do, they want some change going on. So we're going to ask them, what would you like to work on? What are the changes that you want to do? And that is within being respectful of the family, of the culture. That's practicing humility, because we're empowering the client. We're not telling them what they need to do. Now, if they are sharing with us that they've been disconnected, because they won't say cut off, that they've been disconnected or estranged, you know, from a certain family member, then we could say, and what are your thoughts on getting connected again? Or it sounds to me like you're missing them. And I would want to see what is it that they want to do. But by no means, I'm so sorry that that is being interpreted that way. But usually in Bowen Family Systems, what we always want to do is, like an MRI, we want to work with the complainer. So whoever is the person that says, gee, there's something wrong in my family, then those are the people that you usually want to work with. We usually want to work with the pursuers, not the distancers. We want to work with somebody. And usually that person that wakes up and has that aha moment and says, gee, you know, I really need to go to therapy. There's some stuff here that I don't think that I like, is usually the person that is probably more differentiated, because everybody else doesn't see.
Or overfunctioning.
Or overfunctioning. So usually the person that wants to make changes, then usually that's the person that's more differentiated. Usually that person, usually she can bring the family tribe up. Usually.
We have a question on applying these ideas to business, and I'm spelling Chris Burnett's name wrong here.
Burnett.
There we go. Yeah, Christopher Burnett is the one who does it. But is there anyone that's actually written about it that you know offhand that talks directly about it?
Absolutely. At the Georgetown Bowen Center, there's a wonderful book, and what it is a compilation of essays on the emotional side of organizations for businesses and for consulting. So you could go and you could probably get that. Well, all my books are at the university. I've been working from home since March 2020. If not, I would show it to you. I don't have it here at the house, but the emotional side of organizations, definitely. You can also look at the work of Eileen Gottlieb. She does a lot of work with businesses, and she's part of the Florida Family Research Network. And actually, Chris refers a lot of people to Eileen Gottlieb, and she's in Delray. But a lot of her work is she's been working from home, and she's been doing phone consults for years and years and years nationally with family businesses.
And you said the name is Eileen Gottlieb?
Eileen Gottlieb, Gottlieb. Eileen Gottlieb. And let me see if I have.
Let me take a stab at what this might look like. So if you're consulting to a business, you would do a genogram. It would probably look like an org chart, but you would do a genogram to show where the different hierarchy is in the business. The high managers, middle managers, etc. You'd be looking at those relationships with the same kind of conflict cutoff, all those kinds of this. Who, the people in research and development never talk to marketing, right? They're cut off, right? Or the marketing development people are completely fused with the finance people, right?
Absolutely.
So they're fused, right? So you'd be looking at all those kinds of things.
And you're putting in the red, the squiggly lines and the fusion lines, so you're doing all of that.
Right.
And when two businesses come together, that's a marriage. And remember that we always want to ask a few questions, the same thing that we would ask in family therapy. Who's in charge? Who doesn't want to be in charge? Who wants to be in charge? Johnny, the 7-year-old kid that threw the temper tantrum, he wanted to be in charge. So we want to also look at that when we're looking at business organizations as well. And Eileen is spelled E-I-L. And what I can do is I can put in her email address if that's okay.
Please do. Yeah,
Yes,
that'd be
please,
great.
please.
Great.
And you mentioned about the emotional side of organization. Is that the name of the book?
Emotional Side of Organizations out of Georgetown, the Bowen Center, yes.
Great.
EBA family, hang on a second, I'm putting in her email address.
Okay. But then as you were working, so again, as you work with this business, of course, it comes back to the same thing as Michelle pointed out to us, is we have to find out, what does the business want? What did they hire us for as we come in and do this? And so it might be about healing a cutoff between departments or between individuals. I know of someone who does a lot of work with the board, the actual the board of directors, and working with those people and how they interact with each other. And so looking at those relationships, is another way to do the same application of Bowen, and to see who's over functioning, who's under functioning, who wants to be in charge, etc. All of those exact same questions, exact same assessments would be asked of this group of people who just happen to be in the workplace. Now, we're also going to make some assumptions that probably the individuals are interacting at the business the way they are because of their family of origin and how they interact at home. But that's not what we'd be there for. We might send them to therapy, but if we're doing business consulting, we're not doing individual therapy. We're looking at the business as the client.
Right. But we can also ask what their role is, because usually leaders are people that are overfunctioners. We know that. And also don't forget that a lot of organizations and a lot of families and individuals come for therapy, come for consult work. And then when you do the whole big report, they turn around and they're not prepared to make these changes that the outside consultant was paid to do. And they file it away in the trash bin. Same thing with families, because again, be careful what you ask for in terms of, change.
Right. Like the family that begs the father to stop drinking, and then when he does, it completely upsets the homeostasis. Sure.
Exactly.
Same kind of thing.
Exactly.
Well, so let's wrap up. Yes, this entire recording will be available on YouTube as soon as I can get it up. For those of you who have not already, please go to Facebook and follow the Florida Interest Network AAMFT. To follow us. This is where we post our workshops, the link to that, all of those kinds of good things. So that's a way to follow us and find out what's happening. If you are not yet a member of the Florida Interest Network and would like to be a member, you have to have AMFT membership first, and then it's the $25 to become a Florida Interest Network member. But we're perfectly happy for you to follow us on Facebook and things like that without officially being a member of the Interest Network. Though it would awfully be nice if people did. We are about to go into a membership drive because that's one of the ways that we show our demonstrated existence and that we're still a viable group. A great deal of our monies go into advocacy for MFTs in the state of Florida. And so by being a member and paying your money to do that, you're also contributing to the health of our profession in the state. So I will close our recording now, and I thank you all for attending.
And